Hi everyone! Today I'm going over evolution and phylogeny. Today is just going to be a brief introduction to these two topics because this is a pretty broad topic, so I just want to touch on it to introduce it to make sure that in later videos y'all understand the basic concepts and it'll be easier to follow along with those more in-depth videos. So let us get started. Before I move on to the next slide, if y'all don't already know, there are three main domains of life or taxonomic groups of life, and these are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya or eukaryota. And we are eukaryotes, as you can see, animals. And archaea and bacteria are prokaryotes, just different types of single cellular life. We won't really hit today the types of these living organisms, but we are going to talk about how we create trees like this evolutionary tree, which is phylogenetic tree, which is why phylogeny is up here. And we'll talk kind of about the way that evolution occurs and about the brilliant scientists that first came up with the theories that have been proven today to be true about evolution. So let's get into it. So evolution is how life has changed through time, and it is driven by random mutations. I always stress the random word here because this is really important to understand. A lot of people think that evolution, because people say the term survival of the fittest, which is true, but that makes them think that evolution has a goal, I guess, and that's not at all true. Mutations are all random. It's just about the ones that end up being beneficial just by chance, and those get passed down to the next generations purely because the benefits of that mutation allow that organism to live to adulthood, to have enough babies to get their genes passed down. And this is something that happens over a long time, which is why another reason why a lot of people are a little bit confused over evolution. It's not like we're going to see it today. It depends on the organism, obviously, but most organisms, especially big multicellular life like us that don't reproduce that often, we evolve really slowly, millions and hundreds of millions of years. And most evolutionary trends are like ours, really slow. But there are some that can be a little faster, like viruses can mutate a lot more often because they just duplicate a lot more often. Anything that reproduces more often and has more mutations is going to evolve quicker. Even then, though, quicker doesn't mean by tomorrow. But anyway, you get the point. It's a slow process. Okay, moving on to the brilliant scientists who came up with these theories. We have three main names here that are going to be huge game changers. There are a lot more, but these were three huge game changers in terms of taxonomy, phylogeny, and evolution. First, we have Carl Linnaeus, who basically came up with the first ever classification system for living organisms, what is now called the Linnaean classification. And I won't get into the details, but that kind of birthed the thoughts of how these organisms were related to one another. Then you have Darwin and Alfred Wallace came along. Pretty much everybody knows Charles Darwin. Alfred Wallace, though, is a little lesser known, but also a huge game changer in terms of evolution. He and Darwin both came up with the basic fundamental idea behind evolution, in which species come from one common ancestor and then diverge in evolution. And Darwin went on to propose an explanation for how this evolution is occurring, and he proposed natural selection, which is where the term survival of the fittest came into play. And now we'll move on to genetics. So Darwin did come up with natural selection, which is kind of the pathway that evolution uses to occur, but he wasn't exactly sure how the natural selection occurred. He knew that in natural selection, certain mutations were beneficial and those got passed down, but he didn't understand exactly the pathway on which this occurred. During his time, it was thought that genetics was kind of like trait mixing. So for example, if you have a black cat, you have a white cat and they have a baby, it'll be gray. But this isn't exactly how it worked. So Gregor Mendel came along and he kind of revolutionized the field of genetics. And he understood that these traits were caused by units of DNA, or what we call genes, that are not actually mixing. It's just a matter of whether they got expressed or not. Now, speciation is really important when we're talking about evolution because speciation is the mechanism by which branching of phylogenetic trees occurs. So we couldn't really have evolution without speciation because if mutations never built up to a different species, evolution, or at least biodiversity, would not really get anywhere and we would not be here. So speciation is really important. One main mechanism by which speciation occurs is called geographical isolation, and this is shown here in the picture to the top right. You can see this group of snails that are going along and they get separated geographically. So they're so far apart for so long that when they finally find each other again, they've gone through so many mutations and evolutionary trends that now they're so different that they can no longer reproduce with each other successfully, meaning they don't have fertile offspring. An example of this is the snails go to one side of the separation and they are in an environment where it's kind of a lighter sediment or grass down there, then their color might get lighter as a way to try and reduce predation, because they're a little bit more camouflaged. And those that go on the top side, they look a little darker. So maybe their background color or vegetation or whatever they're over there in that environment is going to determine what adaptations are beneficial. And so this goes back to what I said about mutations only being beneficial relative to your environment. For example, if the lighter color is beneficial in one environment because they were more camouflaged, it doesn't mean that it would be beneficial in another environment. It might make them stand out more in another environment and be killed more often. And then those mutations would just die off. So the environment is really important. And so when environmental change occurs, it really makes it hard for certain mutations that have evolved to be beneficial for a certain environment to continue to live on, especially when environmental change is happening at a rapid rate. If we're causing a bunch of deforestation in a bunch of places, taking away habitat of animals, or just radically changing their environment, that is going to cause a lot of extinction, and it already is. And so it's kind of important that we try and preserve as much natural environment as we can for natural wildlife. Moving on to divergent evolution. Okay, so we just talked about speciation, which is kind of the pathway by which divergent evolution occurs, and divergent evolution causes biodiversity. And this is because, for example, I have these limbs shown here to the right. Basically, these all came from one ancestor, and we can tell because all the bone structure is the same. We have a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. All our limbs are the same basic structure in the bone structure, but we have totally different physical, actual limbs. For example, we have an arm, and cats have a similar but very different, arm and paw rather than like hand or fingers. And whales have a fin, that's a bit different. And bats have a wing, but they're all the same because we all have like the five finger digits. We have the hand bones are the same number, same types, just different morphology. We have the radius, we have the ulna, we have the bone up here, I don't know what it's called. And all of those are the same. They're a little bit different in morphology because evolution, but they evolved from one thing, and that is what is called divergent evolution. This is happening because they're differentiating, they're diversifying, they're speciating due to divergent evolution. That's what divergent evolution is. And when divergent evolution happens as a rapid diversification with many new species evolving various adaptations to inhabit many different environments, that is called adaptive radiation. So we can see here this example, the honey creepers. This is a type of bird that reached Hawaii and diversified rapidly. And again, I say rapidly on a geologic timescale. Remember, everything in this course is on a geologic timescale, but it was rapid. And basically this bird shown here on the bottom right went and diversified to all these different beak shapes due to different ecological niches in the new environment that they had found. And they all started separating out into these different niches, and that caused them to have different beak shapes based on their diet. Their diets changed depending on what niche they chose to live in. And then they got so different over time because they were isolated from each other in each niche that they ended up speciating because they could no longer get back to their other sister population and reproduce successfully. So they became whole different species because of this adaptive radiation or rapid divergent evolution. Moving on to convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is due to random mutations like all evolution is, but instead of being from one species diversifying, it's actually an unrelated species or lineages that led to the same survival benefits. So basically, things like flight is a really good example of this. Flight, or the evolution of wings for flying, is pretty much beneficial any way you look at it. It can be beneficial for prey that wants to get off the ground and not be subject to predation. And it can be beneficial to things like predators trying to get a bird's eye view, if you will, on their prey. So it can be beneficial pretty much any way you look at it, but it happened separately in different lineages and time throughout geologic history. For example, birds it happened in, and then mammals, bats it happened in, but these were totally separate events, and they were not only separate by phylogenetic branches, they were also separate in geologic time by a lot. So convergent evolution is basically the evolution of similar traits, but in totally different lineages or unrelated species. Lastly, we're going to go into phylogeny a little bit more. So you can see here, this is on the right, you can see two kind of differently drawn phylogenetic branching tree structures. And this is the debate between gradual or sporadic evolution. So these are called, the one on the far right picture is phylogenetic gradualism or gradualistic evolution. And the one not so much far right is punctuated equilibrium. And you can tell it's a lot more blocky and kind of random events that happened all at once in terms of evolution, which seems like it would not be true. But actually, there's evidence for both of these types of evolution in the rock record. And typically, we have phylogenetic gradualism happening throughout Earth's history, which makes sense. It's happening at a gradual rate, really slow, only a little bit of mutation per time until you get totally different species, and it happens there's so many intermediates before you actually get somewhere in evolution, and that is just a really slow process. But we also see evidence of punctuated equilibrium evolutionary events, but typically this coincides with things like catastrophic events like extinctions. For example, at the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, you have the dinosaurs go extinct, then mammals were allowed to diversify and go crazy with all these new niches that they had because they weren't going to get eaten up by dinosaurs. So there were a lot of new things after each extinction that allowed species that survived the extinction to diversify into new niches that were no longer filled by the species that went extinct. So these are both true in their own right. And so now I want to go into a little bit more about how we actually map out phylogeny. So it's a little bit hard to map out a phylogenetic tree for all of life ever because that's a lot. I think the closest thing you're going to find to that is basically what I showed you on the first slide, that tree with all the domains, the 3 domains, archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. But that is really simplified. The branches are clumped together on that one. If we showed all the branches, it would take a person a lifetime or longer, and it's not complete because we don't have everything from Earth's history preserved. But what we do to make it a little simpler on ourselves is make things like cladograms. A clade is a group of organisms that share a common ancestor, and a cladogram is a diagram of branching lines connecting related groups of organisms that illustrates their degree of relationship. So not only are we branching and putting organisms on this branching diagram, we're also putting traits that are added with each evolutionary step kind of under the branches of each organism. And so that's important because then we can see on a cladogram what traits are coming in when and for what type of organisms. And so, for example, we have this cladogram here of jawless fish first, and then they get jaws, and now they're jawed fish. And then we have amphibians, which had lungs, but they also have jaws. So now you're adding lungs. You're not just saying they got lungs, they don't have jaws. You're adding jaws and lungs. And then you go to reptiles, they have claws or nails, but they also have lungs and jaws. So all these are adding up to each other. You can't make a diagram of organisms that didn't come from the same ancestor. They have to come from the same ancestor, and therefore you can kind of make these traits add up with each other. And then you go to, so from reptiles, you go to birds, which have feathers, and then from birds, you go to mammals, which have fur and mammary glands. Now, the difference here, though, is the trait feathers doesn't actually show up in mammals, so they put it on the branch rather than under. So if you put it under, they all have to add up and be present in the end result, which in this cladogram is mammals. However, bird feathers do not add up to mammals, so they don't get added up. They just show on that one lineage branch, which is birds, and so they are present in birds but not mammals. And so that's the difference between having it there on that branch and underneath where they're all adding. Now, before I move on, I want to disclaimer that physical traits are not at all the only thing that we build phylogeny off of. Actually, it was the only thing that we could use in the past when we didn't have the ability to really look at DNA. But since we now do, and since pretty much ever since genetics became the field that it is today, and I'm not saying it's like over or like done or anything, it's growing like crazy. So if you want to get into genetics, do it, go for it. But now that we have genetics, we can build phylogeny based on way more than just physical traits or what we call anatomical characteristics. We can also use genetics. And so I just emphasized this in this last slide because that's really important. Is you can see in this picture, you can't really read all the words, but basically all these little number and letter codes, I guess, all these little codes are genes, and this is kind of building phylogeny based off of genes. And this is typically done for things that we see today because we have the DNA, whereas in the past we don't really have it preserved. Unless we're incredibly lucky, we might get some preserved, but typically we have to take what we know about the genetics of animals and organisms today and apply it to looking at phylogenetic trees throughout Earth's history. And that has actually really grown the field of studying evolution and phylogeny just astronomically. So that's really important. Remember that genetics plays a big role in building phylogenetic trees and cladograms. And with that, I'm going to end it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye.